All right, I've got a few more things to say about Uncle Tom's Cabin, so let's start it. I want to give you some sense today of what happens to the meanings of this novel as it works its way further and further into popular culture. Close the door. So if you have your book, you can take a look at page 583, and if you don't, you can just listen. This is the moment when Tom addresses Legree near the climax of the novel. Actually, you can go down bottom of 582. Tom looked up at his master and answered, "Master, if you was sick or in trouble or dying and I could save ye, I'd give ye my heart's blood. And if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give him freely as the Lord gave his for me. Oh, Master, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than 'twill me. Do the worst you can. My troubles will be over soon. But if ye don't repent, yours won't never end." Right, and this is about 3 pages before the end of a chapter that's called The Martyr. And this is a moment, that's sometimes problematic for a modern reader, particularly a modern reader who might not share Tom's and Stowe's belief in Christian salvation. You might have trouble accepting Tom's and Stowe's certainty about this, that Tom's troubles are about to be over, but that Legree's will never end, right? Because he is due to have everlasting perdition and damnation. A modern reader is probably more interested in another aspect of this, which we might call unending psychological torments. Right? So we're interested in the kind of psychology of a character like Tom and a psychology of a character like Legree. In a way, readers have more readily identified some of the canonized male authors from this period, like Poe and Hawthorne and Melville, as writers who were interested in psychology in the kind of more modern sense. Henry James would claim this. He said, "The fine thing in Hawthorne is that he cared for the deeper psychology and that in his way he tried to become familiar with it." And I think that Poe and Melville also care about what James calls the deeper psychology. And the way that they go about dramatizing it is to use the conventions of Gothic. They use these conventions to probe it. But I think if we think that Stowe is only about Christian salvation and Christian belief and not at all interested in this kind of psychology, then I think we're mistaking what she's doing at the end of the novel. I think she too, as we've seen, uses Gothic conventions to probe precisely this. She is interested in what we might think of as psychological torment, right? So that Cassie's successful hoax directed at Legree can only work because Legree is inwardly tormented, and tormented in a way that we would think of as coming out of his feelings of guilt. The episode suggests more than that. It suggests that there are people like Legree whose psychological torments are so great, who are so depraved, you might say, psychology, who have fallen so far into evil, that they can no longer be saved by Christian feeling. It's too late for people like Legree. There are limits, in other words, Stowe seems to suggest, to what Christianity can do, although she quickly pulls away from that. Right? The career of Cassie demonstrates that. Stowe turns away from Gothic at the end of the novel, as is suggested last time, and back towards her particular brand of Christian sentimental fiction. And so finally, as we suggested at the very end, but I want to reiterate, the form that the novel finally takes is the form of a sermon. Or perhaps we might say that what we realize is that what we've been reading is a sermon by other means. Right? A sermon that uses fiction to dramatize it. And in that sense, we might think that it has profound affinities with other things that we've seen earlier in the course. Perhaps Wigglesworth's Day of Doom, right, which has all of those kind of intertextual references and clearly suggests to you that it is, in some sense, preaching a sermon to you. Right? So above all, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a Christian novel. It is a Christian novel that is also, as a result of its being a Christian novel, profoundly against slavery. Okay, it's the stance of being against slavery comes out of Stowe's belief in Christianity. And it also links her to other female domestic writers of the period. But you might say there's a difference between what she what she shows us and what a lot of these other female domestic novelists tend to show. They tend to show that if you are Christian, if you lead a good life, you will in fact receive some kind of worldly success. That's not what Stowe is interested in. Stowe is profoundly not interested in the worldly. And in fact, her two most exemplary Christian characters, Ava and then Tom, prove to die, right, and following the template of Christ's life. And you might say the thing that she finally does, Stowe, is to go after slavery in profoundly Christian terms. In other words, what's wrong with slavery is that in some deep way it is a sin. And so if you are a Christian and you perpetrate slavery or perpetuate it or even participate in it all, you are committing a sin from which you need to be redeemed. And I think there's something about that, then, that's really what finally distinguishes her from Hawthorne, Melville, Poe, writers like that. In other words, Stowe, I think, is interested in psychology, and she's interested in Christianity, but she isn't, at the very end, interested in thinking about this in any way ironically, right? She uses irony, we've seen in her narrative voice, to push forward her Christian agenda. But at the end, there is no irony whatsoever, no second thinking, no second guessing about Tom's final victory, as that chapter is called, right? And that kind of a moment, I think, doesn't exist in the works of Poe or Hawthorne or Melville. So that part of what's distinctive about Stowe is that she can regard Tom's triumph absolutely without irony. And that's part of the moral fabric of the book. Now, one of the things that happens, and you can see that here in this illustration from a later edition, right? I mean, this is Tom's ultimate moment here, and we have, Christ appearing here, basically, in that final moment. That element starts to get lost very quickly from adaptations of Uncle Tom. And I wanted just to give you a sense of this, because this has something to do with something that's been a theme for us, I think, at least since Winthrop, which is that writers create certain kinds of meanings, certain kinds of symbols, they create texts, they release these texts, they have a relationship, these texts do, to something that we've called the horizon of expectations. A writer makes a decision about how to pitch his or her texts and symbols and literary creations. But ultimately, the meaning of those things is going to be determined in large part by readers, right? And meanings will circulate throughout the culture. So that Winthrop creates the idea of the city on the hill, which he means to be a figuration for the ideal relation between a community and individuals, in which the communal quickly comes first. Immediately it comes first. Individual is supposed to be subsumed by the community. The whole point of the sermon is that the city on the hill will exist if we really believe in the bonds of Christian love, a body politic that is linked together by the ligaments of Christ's love. By the time you get to Ronald Reagan, who considers himself a Christian, he's nevertheless a different kind of Christian. And he can appropriate Winthrop's symbol and turn its meanings almost completely around, so that it becomes a way of suggesting that if the individual pursues his or her own version of the good, these communal benefits will follow afterwards. It really uses the logic of laissez-faire. Winthrop would have been appalled. When we read the Scarlet Letter, we're going to see exactly that. I want you to think of it in those terms, right? Here is a woman who is caught committing adultery. And the way she is punished is that the male, the Puritan fathers in Boston decide to make a show of her. They put her up on a scaffold, which is like a stage. They pin an A onto her chest to stand for adulterer. Every time you look at her, you're supposed to look at the A. It's meant to efface her individuality, to typecast her, to make her, you might say, into an actor in something akin to a social medieval mystery play. But at the very beginning, you might say, the meaning of that A starts to slip and slide and change, right? Hester is allowed, or I suppose it's a version of Hester is, as Christ was forced to carry his own cross, Hester is forced to sew her own A. But she's clever, and she's a good seamstress, and she's good at embroidery. So she puts this extremely lavish version of the A on herself, and people are drawn to this, and the reader's eye is drawn to it by Hawthorne. And as you'll remember, as the novel progresses, the meaning of the A starts to become multiple. It starts to change. The official meaning, therefore, starts to give way to something else. And so that Hawthorne's novel can be read in large part as a sort of study in what happens to meanings, how they evolve as they circulate in culture. right? And you could say by the end, the very thing that that the Puritan fathers want Hester to do, to repent, is actually the opposite of what she does. But the fact of the A actually prevents them from seeing what's really going on with her. We'll talk about this more on Monday. But I hope, and my hope is that having been through about 3/4 of the course now, you will look at the Scarlet Letter in a way that's different than you might have looked at it not only at the beginning of the term, but whenever you read it last. Similar things happen to the meanings of Uncle Tom. I already suggested this to you last time. So the novel is serialized in 1851. It's scheduled for book form in 1852. It's already a wild success. And from 1852 on, into the 20th century, there are adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin almost continuously on the American stage, and they're amongst the most popular theatrical productions that any theater company could stage. If you want to have a hit, stage Uncle Tom's Cabin. Still, by the way, never earned any money from these adaptations because we talked a little bit about the copyright law, and even the domestic copyright law that was there didn't really apply to stage productions, right? So she didn't earn anything from this. So even before the novel is published in 1852, it's adapted for the stage. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or As It Is, and the subtitle is The Southern Uncle Tom, is produced on January 5th, 1852 at the Baltimore Museum. And then there is this one, which is in August of 1852 by C.W. Taylor at Purdy's National Theater here in New York. Purdy's Theater was down on Chatham Street, just a few blocks south of Bowery. And it was already well known as a kind of popular place where you could often see blackface minstrel shows being performed, and T.D. Rice was one of the most famous of these performers. According to the scholar Sarah Meir, who studied this stuff, she says that Taylor's was a typical sensation melodrama, an afterpiece meant to fill a space in a program rather than to cause controversy. It played on different nights alongside a nautical drama, a tightrope walker, and a blackface burlesque of Othello. And it was described by a newspaper in New York, the New York Herald, as, quote, an exaggerated mockery of Southern institutions calculated to poison the minds of our youth with the principles of abolitionism. And it closed after only 11 performances. Now, listen to that. It's a newspaper in New York saying that the youth were being poisoned by the principles of abolitionism. There's a sense in which, if this shouldn't surprise you, I suppose. I mean, New York was not clearly in favor of abolition, and there were factions in New York, particularly those who were identified with kind of nativist sentiments, who were sympathetic to the South and were profoundly racist. I'll show you a clip from Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York that not only shows you how people took liberties with Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also that gets that point across. The first version that did succeed was commissioned by G.C. Howard, who was the manager of the Troy, New York Museum, and he wanted to feature his 4-year-old daughter Cordelia as Little Ava. So Howard played St. Clair, his wife played Topsy, and their version of Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by his cousin George Aiken, who played the part of George Harris and got $40 and a gold watch for writing the adaptation. Aiken's version is reasonably faithful to the novel. It adds a few Yankee characters for comic relief, but a lot of the dialogue simply comes out of the book. The Troy production apparently was seen by 25,000 people in Troy, New York. The total population of Troy at the time was 30,000 people, so not too bad. It moved on to New York City, and the Howard family continued performing this play for the next 30 years, until 1887, when Howard himself died, and when little Cordelia, who's been playing Little Eva since her 4th birthday, celebrated her 35th birthday. Not so little anymore. One of the set pieces in Aiken's adaptation was Eliza crossing the Ohio, right? So this is one of the big moments that people always wanted to see. How are they going to do this scene? And subsequent dramatizations of this by Aiken and by Howard and other people became more and more elaborate. So the novel really doesn't have Eliza being pursued by dogs, but dogs became de rigueur later on. And in fact, later productions would argue that they would advertise that they had real bloodhounds, and then really big bloodhounds, and just a lot of really big bloodhounds. Double mammoth Uncle Tom. I guess that had really big dogs. And eventually you have these adaptations closing with Tom, sometimes with actual machinery in a kind of golden carriage that was ascending upwards, and you would see Ava there and her father waiting for him, sometimes possibly at a certain point accompanied by an image of Abraham Lincoln, that kind of thing. But gradually what happens to this is that more and more of the elements of minstrel shows enter into performances of the play, particularly in the characterizations of Tom and one other character. Who do you suppose? Who seems ripe for characterization by blackface performers or as a kind of, as a butt of comedy? Topsy, yeah, Topsy. So you would go to see that. So by the end of the century, these things became less and less adaptations, and what they were referred to derogatively as Tom shows. And it's on that basis that the character of Uncle Tom gets transformed into this extremely negative stereotype of African Americans. It becomes a symbol of black obsequiousness rather than idealized Christian humility. And you might say one of the things that happens to Stowe's story is that it's drained of both its Christian imagery and therefore its moral power, and it just becomes kind of melodrama. I wanted to give you a sense of this, so I'm going to show you some clips. The first two clips come from a 1903 silent adaptation of this. The first one is Eliza's Escape. The second one is The Death of Tom. And then there's another clip, which is from the 1927 version, which gets at some of these minstrel type motifs. Yes. Okay, you got the point. This is The Death of Tom. You get the idea. Now, this one is it has higher production values for, let's say, the stagey ones. But you can see, it shows you, it'll give you a sense of how the kind of minstrel show motifs work their way into the novel. Okay, so you get this, you get the idea. And you can see how what would happen is that in these productions, it would be little moments like that would start to become what the shows were about rather than the larger plot. All right, this is from Gangs of New York. It'll give you a sense of the way in which productions were dramatized and seen.
The divisions between us. This war must cease. North and South must stand united. Mr. Legree, lay down your whip. Miss Eliza, join hands with Mr. Shelby. And Topsy, dear little Topsy, cradle Uncle Tom's head.
There are certain things that are inaccurate historically about Martin Scorsese's movie, but it does a pretty good job of dramatizing certain aspects of life in the 5 points. And if you're interested in reading a little bit more about what going to plays was actually like, there are wonderful pieces by Irving and by Whitman about the experience of theater in that time. All right, let's turn to Hawthorne now, and in some senses by way of contrast. The writings of Hawthorne and Melville bring to a climax a tradition of writing that we've been looking at for a while now, and that we tend to refer to as American romance, right? So we would include in this most likely Charles Brockden Brown, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau writing in their slightly different way. But in fiction, we're thinking about, for us, it's Brown, Irving, Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville. And one of the things that as the quote makes clear, one of the things that Hawthorne is doing is deliberately setting himself over and against the tradition of domestic fiction, for which he had mostly contempt. America is now wholly given over to a damned mob of scribbling women. I should have no chance of success while the public taste is occupied with their trash, and should be ashamed of myself if I did succeed, right? Both Hawthorne and Poe sought to create a new kind of reading public. I mean, Poe, in addition to being a short story writer, was also a journalist and critic, and he was really doing everything that he could to mold public taste according to have a kind of greater appreciation of the aesthetic values that are within text. Hawthorne sought to create a form of writing that would be thought of as more elevated than typical prose, and that didn't have the association with the world of domesticity and this mob of scribbling women that the novel did. So he called his form romance. And so he referred to the 4 completed book-length fictions, The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, The Blithedale Romance, and The Marble Fawn, as romances. And he's using it in contradistinction to the term novel, deliberately. And in the preface to The House of the Seven Gables, he suggests the reason why. If you have your anthology, it's on page 1493. He says this: "When a writer calls his work a romance, it need hardly be observed that he wishes to claim a certain latitude both as to its freedom and material, which he would not have felt entitled to assume had he professed to be writing a novel. The latter form of composition is presumed to aim at a very minute fidelity not merely to the possible, but to the probable and ordinary course of man's experience. The former, while as a work of art, it must rigidly subject itself to laws, and while it sins unpardonably so far as it may swerve aside from the truth of the human heart, has fairly a right to present that truth under circumstances to a great extent of the writer's own choosing or creation. If he think fit, he may so manage his atmospherical medium as to bring out or mellow the lights and deepen and enrich the shadows of the picture. He will be wise, no doubt, to make a very moderate use of the privileges here stated, and especially to mingle the marvelous rather as a slight, delicate, and evanescent flavor rather than as any portion of the actual substance of the dish offered to the public. He can hardly be said, however, to commit a literary crime, even if he disregard this caution." Now, I want you to look at this, since you've just sort of done this as your second paper. I want you to look at this as a piece of prose, and tell me how it works. It's very typical of Hawthorne's prose. So if we figure out how this works, you'll have a leg up when you're trying to figure out how not only the two stories that we read for today work, but the Scarlet Letter. So, anything that anybody notices? Yeah?
Well, there are sort of two metaphors that work. One is the piece of writing as a theatrical production.
Mm-hmm.
The piece of writing as a
Okay.
dish.
As a dish. Okay, good. So show me, let's nail it down. Where's the theatrical stuff?
If you think it fit, also he may so manage his atmospheric medium as to bring out or meld the lights to even enrich the shadows of the picture.
Picture?
Yeah, okay. I sort of read that.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think there's, it's both of those things. You could say manage his atmospherical medium. You could certainly say it's like a stage manager, setting a mise en scène and choosing to raise or lower the lights. You could also think of pictures like, I don't know, a good example would be Caravaggio perhaps, that you make use of chiaroscuro, right? The shifting from light into darkness. So he's clearly evoking both of those, that kind of pictorial imagination, whether on stage or in picture. Okay, what was the second metaphor?
Food.
Okay, so food. Actual substance of the dish offered to the public. Okay, that's good. So there are two governing metaphors here. Great. Anything else? Let's go back to the beginning. When a writer calls his work a romance, it need hardly be observed that he wishes to claim a certain latitude, both as to its fashion and material, which he would not have felt himself entitled to assume had he professed to be writing a novel. So how does that sentence work? What's that? It's very close to, I don't need to tell you that. Parallipsis, good. What does it do for him? Yeah.
He still hasn't defined what he means by romance. He's only defined what romance is not.
Okay, so he's defining things negatively. That's a good thing to notice about Hawthorne. He's going to start off with a term. When a writer calls his work a romance, but look what he actually goes and says about it. It need hardly be observed. So the impersonal construction creates the veneer of authority. It need hardly be observed. The parallipsis probably is there to heighten the sense of authority. That he wishes to claim what? A certain latitude. That's a paradoxical phrase because it's not certain at all, right? A certain latitude. It seems like it's certain, but then when you think about it, how much latitude? A certain latitude, both as to its fashion and material, that he would not have felt himself to assume had he professed to be writing a novel, right? So it's antithesis. It's one thing compared to the other. The latter form of composition, the novel, is presumed to aim at a very minute fidelity. Now again, look at this. It's a passive construction, so in this sense, there's a way in which we could say it's meant to, again, create this veneer of a kind of authenticity or authority. But by whom is it presumed? I mean, where's the agency there? It's presumed to aim at a very minute fidelity, not merely to the possible, but to the probable and ordinary. So it's not just the possible, but the probable and ordinary. This is what the novel is supposed to do. The former, and look at the way in which the prose breaks, right? It's constantly qualified, it's hedged. The former, while as a work of art it must rigidly subject itself to laws, and while it sins unpardonably, so as far as it may swerve away from the truth of the human heart, all right, so we assume that it's a work of art, and therefore it has to subject itself to laws. And there's the implication, I guess, that the novel presumes to this, so it still has to concern itself with the truth of the human heart. And why use this word? Sins unpardonably. That's the kind of word that Stowe might use, right? Why would you use the language of sinning? So far as it may swerve aside from the truth of the human heart, has fairly a right. What does that mean? Sort of a right? Or in all fairness? Has fairly a right to present that truth under circumstances, how much? To a great extent of the writer's own choosing or creation. Where have we gotten to? How much? If he think fit also, he may so manage his atmospherical medium as to bring out mellow lines. Okay, we've got that. He will be wise, no doubt, to make a very moderate use of the privileges here stated, and especially to mingle the marvelous rather as a slight, delicate, and evanescent flavor rather than as any portion of the actual. Now what's at stake in the conjunction of these two things, sinning unpardonably and the dish metaphor. He's openly contesting the novel, saying that the romance does something different, so he's just distinguishing the romance. But why use that, and why use that? I've already given you a hint. Who thinks in these terms? Sinning unpardonably, and who cooks? I mean, cooking is a big part of domestic life, right? I mean, who cooks in Uncle Tom's Cabin? It's Mammy and Dinah. There's a certain way in which we might say the domestic novelists have a fire hydrant, and Hawthorne is peeing on it. Right? I mean, the subtext of this is, he will appropriate their language of sinning, but we are going to turn it to the artistic or the aesthetic, which they claim not to be interested in doing. And we can do domestic imagery better than they can. Right? Here we go. Mingle it rather as a slight delicate and evanescent flavor than as any portion of the actual dish offered to the public. So you might say he's taking their ground and appropriating it for himself. He can hardly be said, however, to commit a literary crime even if he disregard this caution. So the question I ask you now is, how much of the marvelous does the writer get to use? According to Hawthorne here. How much marvelous is good? Yeah.
Well, he can use as much as he wants and still not commit literary crime.
Exactly. He can use as much as he wants. So who is the arbiter of what's the right amount? The author, right? One of the things I want you to see here that Hawthorne is doing is creating a space for romance that's going to have it inhabit something that we might think of as the aesthetic and that is closer to our idea now of what the literary is. That means propping up the author. Right? It's part of the project that we saw going on in Irving too, when he makes use of the guise of the historian. Right? He tries to take some of the authority of the historian, and then by mixing it with local facts that most historians would know, and by certain things that he invents, he ultimately creates himself to be his own authority, right? He's pushing, in other words, the authority of the imagination over the authority of the regime of facts. So facts and history, that's about the possible, the probable, the ordinary. Fine as it goes, but you miss something. It's not enough. It's not the whole story. To get the whole story, you need more than that. You need some of the marvelous. You might need a lot of the marvelous. It's sort of up to you to judge. This is the same stance that you will see Hawthorne adopting in the Custom House preface to the Scarlet Letter, which you'll read over the weekend. Right? He's talking about himself in the Custom House in the 19th century. He comes talking ostensibly about how he comes to edit a manuscript that he has discovered called the Scarlet Letter. Right? And he'll go and he tells you about, here's this manuscript, and I opened it up, and this piece of whatever it was, this cloth fell out. And so he almost says you could come and see it if you want. Right? He's trying to say that he has the authority of authenticity, of truth. This really happened. Of course, in the same way that he creates this, he can hardly be said to commit a literary crime, even if he disregards this caution. He will say, of course, in the Scarlet Letter, I don't vouch for a word-for-word transcription. I vouch for the larger truth of the thing, the outlines of the tale, which means that in the end, he's claiming just to be a mere editor of this manuscript, but we really have no idea how much of it is a really true manuscript, if we believe in that fiction, and how much of it is his own imagination. Right? So one of the things I want you to see is he's going even further than Irving in attempting to appropriate some of the authority that even in this period accrues to the historian and shift it someplace else. That's one thing. Towards the literary, towards the province of the imagination. And then even within the province of the imagination and the literary, he wants to shift things further away from where they might be said to have kind of settled at the beginning of the 19th century, away from the novel to something more rarefied, and he thinks of more imaginative, in some sense, more fictional even, because it isn't so bound to the probable and ordinary course of man's experience, and that is what he calls romance. Okay, so that's one of the things to bear in mind. Hawthorne is taking these terms and trying to shift them. He does not want to say that he has no relation to what we might think of as morality or truth. In fact, the argument would seem to be that the romance gets you closer to a sort of higher moral truth because it isn't bound simply by what we can see and experience in the everyday, right? It is linked to the marvelous. And what are miracles, for example, if not some aspect of the marvelous, right? What I want you to see is that Hawthorne is taking this idea of romance and appropriating it. Already that's a kind of appropriation itself of the term romance. I mean, later on he'll say in the Custom House that this is a kind of figure for what happens in a romance. He says that we have the creation of what he calls a neutral territory, somewhere between the real world and fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet and each imbue itself with the nature of the other, right? So the sense in which romance is bringing things together. It's bringing together the possible, the ordinary, sure, but also something else beyond it. And it's in that bringing together, in that fundamental reconciliation of things that might seem to be separate, that romance works, right? So you think about this moment is the moment when he's talking about the child's playroom. It looks a certain way in the day. At night, it looks different. And when it's really interesting, is precisely that moment that he seems to refer to in the preface to the House of the Seven Gables, when the shadows start to emerge. And we get what he calls this neutral territory, some kind of the gray. So that you might say the thing that's interesting to Hawthorne is the gray space. Some would call it the liminal space, in between one thing and another. So that overall, I would say, a productive way of thinking about Hawthorne is he's somebody who's trying to get away from a logic of either or to a logic of both and we'll try to see how that works over the next 2 times. Now he's deploying romance to help him in this project. Romance already meant something else, and he's trying to in some sense, ennoble it. In sort of the same way that Gothic was a term that Charles Brockden Brown tried to ennoble and make a part of a larger public discourse, Hawthorne is trying to ameliorate the meanings of romance. Later in the century, Henry James kind of captures what the standard sense of romance was in Hawthorne's day. He said, the only general attribute of projected romance that I can see is the fact of a kind of experience with which it deals. Experience liberated, so to speak. Experience disengaged, disembroiled, disencumbered, exempt from the conditions that we usually know to attach from it, right? There's something fantastic about it. It's not grounded in real life. Hawthorne, I think, wants contrary to James, wants to say that, in fact, there is a kind of tether. There is a link between these things. Now, James, by the way, James was one of James's major inspirations was Hawthorne. In fact, it's possible to think of some of his later fictions as almost kind of rewrites of some of Hawthorne's fictions. Walter Scott, roughly contemporary with certainly Irving and with Hawthorne as well, said we now use the term romance as synonymous with fictitious composition. Right? So romance it's just another way of talking about fiction. Another representative comment comes from a retired general from the army. The facts and scenes of the Revolution, he said, were so strange and heroic that they resembled ingenious fables or the dreams of romance rather than the realities of authentic history. Right? So I want you to see how these dichotomies are being set up. Dreams of romance on the one hand, reality on the other, authentic history on the other. Hawthorne is trying to bridge this gap. Both and rather than either or. And even Charles Brockden Brown distinguished romance not from novels but from history as well. He said similar things. Romance for him was not one kind of fiction as opposed to fact, but all of fiction as opposed to fact. Hawthorne is going to do something different. He's going to divide fiction up. He's going to promote a certain view of a certain kind of fiction, and he's going to call that kind romance. So I want you to understand that Hawthorne is turning to romance in a climate, a kind of cultural climate that is hostile to it. That either is suspicious of it because it's either a low form or because it's still there's a worry about the status of fiction. Isn't fiction telling tales? Isn't fiction lying? But Hawthorne wants to do something different with it. He wants to say that it's radically different from the novel because it doesn't limit itself to the probable and the possible, because it gets at this, and this is important, this idea of the truth of the human heart. And I think one way to think about it is think about the kind of things that Poe is interested in, right? Poe is interested in uncovering stuff that's within and that kind of makes itself come out. Just imagine, as a thought experiment, imagine if young Goodman Brown were told in the first person, if it were Brown himself who were telling the story. I suggest to you that that would probably be the way that Poe would do it. It would seem to be a lot like a kind of Poe story. You can imagine, right? Guy tells a story of he's going to the woods, and then all of a sudden he realizes that everybody around him is either mad or depraved or a witch or something crazy like that, and Poe would leave it there. I suggest to you that what Hawthorne does is more interesting even than that. But to understand what it is that Hawthorne is doing there, we need to put another category on the table, and that is allegory. If you have your book, you can take a look at page 1332 to get the full passage here that I'm going to read. This is from a famous story that unfortunately we don't have time to read, although it's terrific. It's called Rappaccini's Daughter. And again, you can see affinities between Hawthorne and Irving here. Again, Hawthorne creates a kind of fictitious alter ego. The writings, the Rappaccini's Daughter, the writings of one Aubépine, which turns out to be French for Hawthorne. And he says this to preface the story, Irving-esque. We do not remember to have seen any translated specimens of the productions of Monsieur de l'Aubépine, a fact that less to be wondered at, as his very name is unknown to many of his own countrymen, as well as to the student of foreign literature. As a writer, he seems to occupy an unfortunate position between the transcendentalists, who under one name or other have their share in all the current literature of the world, and the great body of pen and ink men who address the intellect and sympathies of the multitude. Right? So this is another image of in-betweenness. Here are these literati types, these transcendentalists. And then there's the normal people that most people, journalists and others that most people are reading. If not too refined, at all events too remote, too shadowy and unsubstantial in his modes of development to suit the class of the latter taste, and yet too popular to satisfy the spiritual or metaphysical requisitions of the former, he must necessarily find himself without an audience, except here and there an individual or possibly an isolated clique, right? So Hawthorne is kind of writing about, I guess, what he perceives to be his own situation. And he perceives to be somebody who's caught in betwixt and between. He's sort of popular, but not as popular as he would like. He's not quite respected enough among the intellectuals, perhaps. His writings, and again, this is a typically Hawthornian sort of hedged sentence. We give and then we take away a little bit, sort of sidle up to our description. His writings, to do them justice, are not altogether destitute. So how much is there? Are not altogether destitute of fancy and originality. They might have won him greater reputation, but for an inveterate love of allegory, which is apt to invest his plots and characters with the aspect of scenery and people in the clouds, and to steal away some of the human worth out of his conceptions. He is ventriloquizing, obviously, criticisms that were made of his own writing. Right? But it's interesting to see then that there's what people took a look at Hawthorne and thought of him as doing something that we might link to allegory. Now that's not a bad thing necessarily. Allegory was in fact a very popular form. But allegory is exactly the kind of form that would bother Hawthorne because it wants to map meanings exactly from one place to another. We'll see how this works in just a minute. So Hawthorne is really interested in allegory, right? He says that two of his favorite writers are Spenser and Bunyan. Spenser, who is known as one of the premier allegory, both of them, and John Bunyan, who is probably one of the most widely read books in New England from the colonial period onto Hawthorne's day. You'll remember that Miss Ophelia has a copy of Bunyan on her shelf next to her Milton, right? So one of the things that we might say here, looking at this description from Rappaccini's Daughter, this idea of being the aspect of scenery and people in the clouds, and to steal away some of the human warmth. There's something cold and intellectual, we might say, about allegory. In other words, rather than trying to represent people and their fullness and complexity, allegory, people have often thought, doesn't represent fully in that way. It's kind of illustrative. It's more interested in getting across certain concepts, and therefore its plots and its people are simply there to serve as illustrations of these concepts. So Coleridge, for example, said that allegory was a translation of abstract notions into picture language. And the term allegory itself comes from Greek roots, which mean to speak other than openly. Right? So one of the things is you're saying something in a different way than you might. But we were meant to understand that there's a kind of one-to-one correlation between those two things. According to a guy named Angus Fletcher, who's a famous scholar of allegory and who wrote the piece, interestingly, on Whitman that I asked you to look at, he says, in simplest terms, allegory says one thing and means another. Now you might say what allegory actually says isn't exactly unimportant, to use a kind of Hawthornian construction. In fact, it may be very realistic. Hawthorne himself said that he read Pilgrim's Progress for the story. Has anybody read Pilgrim's Progress? Yeah, I'll give you a little taste of it. Well, imagine reading Pilgrim's Progress for the story or for the characters. You'll see why that seems silly. Fletcher says the whole point of allegory is that it doesn't need to be read in this biblical way, exegetically. It often has a literal level that makes good sense by itself. But I would suggest to you that that is almost never the primary interest of the allegory, that literal level. What we're interested in is the other meaningness of it, that other thing that all of those plot elements and character elements are pointing to. The sermon, you might say, beneath the story. So the crucial part about allegory might be is that it's illustrative, and therefore its relation to reality seems to be at a further remove than most fiction. It's less interested in the real world, as it were, than ideas about the real world. It's interested, in other words, in kind of abstraction, in sort of abstract ideas. To illustrate this, let me give you a few snippets from Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 1678. And its full title is The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come, delivered under the similitude of a dream by John Bunyan. And again, next to the Bible, it was the most widely read in New England during the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the beginning. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where there was a den. And I laid me down in that place to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamt a dream. Okay, so important to remember this idea of the dreamer. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back. Now, this should remind you of your Wigglesworth, right? He says he's basically referring you back to the Bible. If you went and looked in the Bible, you would realize that what this is an allegory of the individual, sinner. And in fact, the maker of the backpack that he's carrying is in fact sin. Right? So he's carrying this weight of sin on the back. I looked, and I saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able longer to contain, he brake out with a lamentable crying, saying, "What shall I do?" And again, this is meant to say, we're dramatizing something that's come from the Bible. Now the narrator goes on. Now I saw in my dream that just as they had ended this talk, this is a little bit later on, he's met somebody else, right? This figure, whose name turns out to be Christian. So as they had ended this talk, they drew near to a very miry slough that was in the midst of the plain, and they, being heedless, did both fall suddenly into the bog. The name of the slough was Despond. Slough is an interesting word, by the way. If it has to do with snakes, it's the kind of word my younger son hates because it breaks all the rules and breaks its own rules. Slough, if it's for snakes. Slough, usually with the slough of Despond. Slough, if you're British. And possibly if you come from New England, slough, if you're talking about average, ordinary bogs, but still slough if you're talking about this one. So I think for simplicity's sake, let's just say slough. The slough was Despond. Here, therefore, they wallowed for a time, being grievously bedaubed with the dirt. And Christian, because of the burden that was on his back, began to sink in the mire, the burden of sin. Right, you start to understand how this is working a little bit later on. Christian was left to tumble in the slough of despond alone, but he endeavored to struggle to that side of the slough that was still further from his own house and next to the wicket gate, the which he did, but could not get out because of the burden that was on his back. But I beheld in my dream that a man came to him whose name was Help, and asked him what he did there. Sir, said Christian, I was bid go this way by a man called Evangelist, who directed me also to yonder gate, that I might escape the wrath to come. And I was going thither, I felt here. Help says, but why did you not look for the steps? And Christian says, Fear followed me so hard that I fled the next way and fell in. And Help says, then said he, give me thy hand. So he gave him his hand, and he drew him out, set him upon sound ground, and bid him go his way. And again, it invokes the Psalms, right? So I want you to see how this works, right? I mean, how does that work? We can clearly see that what this is an allegory of, it's really about the progress of the Christian soul away from things like sin and despair, with the temptations that you have, the help that you get from others, to a place that Christian has to go. It's called the celestial city, right? So it's how the soul gets to heaven. And that's really what it is. It's a kind of a sermon that's lightly dramatized. So I think you get the allegory-ness of it, right? I mean, there's a character. His name is Help. We don't know too much about Help. He's not really described for us, because what he looks like isn't important. What's important about him is that he is the embodiment of the idea of help. Right? So later on, Christian meets people like Help. They have other names. Simple, sloth, presumption, hypocrisy. Yeah. He goes on a little sightseeing. Places like the Valley of Humiliation, always fun. Even more fun, the Valley of the Shadow of Death. He's joined, he has a few other people who help him along, who serve as tour guides. These are people named Hopeful, Faithful. He's the one who actually helps convert Christian in the end. You get the idea. The narrative in which these characters are appearing is a sermon. It's a theological discussion about Christian salvation. And that's the sense in which the allegory says one thing. It pretends to be telling a story about these characters, but it means another thing. This is really a sermon about the progress of the Christian soul. Okay, Hawthorne is interested in this form. He's interested at times in making use of it, and we could say it's in part because it's a form that people think they know how to read in his moment. But he's also interested, I think, in demonstrating its limitations. And as I'll suggest further on Monday, I think that's because he understands that allegorical thinking has an inordinate amount of power in the middle of the 19th century as a result of the kind of continuing residue of Calvinism. And so that's why he's going to go after it, you might say, in his writing. So now we turn to this story, which if you printed it out, please pull it out, called The Celestial Railroad, which was woefully omitted from this edition of the Norton. But I think it'll give you a sense of what's going on with Hawthorne and allegory. It's quite clearly, openly, in fact, it refers to Bunyan. It's quite clearly a send-up of Bunyan's Pilgrims Progress. In fact, on page 1305 of this, he refers to Bunyan. He says, the respectable Apollyon was now putting on the steam at a prodigious rate, anxious perhaps to get rid of the unpleasant reminiscences connected with the spot where he had so disastrously encountered Christian. Consulting Mr. Bunyan's road book, I perceive that we must now be within a few miles of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, right? So Bunyan is now like the guidebook. It's like Fodor's or Let's Go Celestial City, right? That's what Bunyan is. And he's making fun of it in that way. The story we imagine here, therefore, is a kind of updated 19th century transcendentalist version of the pilgrimage to the Celestial City. We don't have to walk anymore. We can take the train, that very emblem of 19th century American progress. We have all the modern conveniences. Take a look at page 1302, for example. This is the first full paragraph. It really seemed to me, however, that the bridge vibrated and heaved up and down in a very formidable manner. In spite of Mr. Smooth-it-away's testimony to the solidity of its foundation, I should be loath to cross it in a crowded omnibus, especially if each passenger were encumbered with as heavy luggage as that gentleman and myself. Now, if we know Bunyan, we're starting to get the joke, right? Heavy luggage. I mean, all the luggage what's the luggage that Christians carrying around? It's a bunch of sin. So if you got really heavy luggage, you got problems. But luckily, you got a train to carry it for you. Nevertheless, we got over without accident and soon found ourselves at the station house. This very neat and spacious edifice is erected on the site of the little wicket gate, which formerly, as all old pilgrims will recollect, stood directly across the highway, and by its inconvenient narrowness was a great obstruction to the traveler of liberal mind and expansive stomach. The reader of John Bunyan will be glad to know that Christian's old friend evangelist, who was accustomed to supply each pilgrim with a mystic roll, now presides at the ticket office. Right? So you can see what's going on here. There's almost a kind of Franklinian bringing down to earth of some of this, as if we're making fun of Bunyan, right? We're making fun of that kind of pious Christianity? Or are we? Is that the only thing that we're making fun of? Take a look at the top of 1304, right? There seems to be, again, this idea of making fun of pilgrims that do it the old-fashioned way. Let's see. Just at the top of the page, second line. It was laughable while we glanced along, as it were, at the tail of a thunderbolt, to observe two dusty foot travelers in the old pilgrim guise, with cockleshell staff, their mystic rolls of parchment in their hands, and their intolerable burdens on their backs. The preposterous obstinacy of these honest people in persisting to groan and stumble along the difficult pathway, rather than take advantage of modern improvements, railway, right, excited great mirth among our wiser brotherhood. We greeted the two pilgrims with many pleasant jibes and roar of laughter, whereupon they gazed at us with such woeful and absurdly compassionate visages that our merriment grew tenfold more obstreperous. Right? You can see what's going on here. What is the suggestion that the story is making? Is the story really making fun of these pilgrims? Who's the butt of the humor here? In a name like Mr. Smooth It Away. What's going on there? Mr. Live for the World. Mr. Hide Sin in the Heart. How is this working? With whom or what are we supposed to agree? You read Bunyan, you know what you're supposed to think. You're supposed to avoid the slough of despond. You're supposed to make your way with the aid of help and faith through the valley of the shadow of death, blah, blah, blah. You're supposed to get to the celestial city. We're right there with the allegorist. Where are we here? What's being made fun of? Is that? Yeah, certainly in large part. The narrator himself is part of is falling under the butt of the joke here, you might say. This is an unreliable allegorist as narrator, right? He doesn't quite see the problems that are going on. He's thinking like, oh, we're so modern. You know, I have these great traveling companions, Mr. Smooth It Away, Mr. Hide Sin in the Heart, and we're going to get really fast to the celestial city.
And doesn't represent a literal landscape that he'll actually have to go through. But at the same time,
Wait, so reading Bunyan in his road book means that he's thinking of it literally, like for the story and as a guide to the landscape.
Yeah.
Not as an allegory.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I haven't figured out totally how to explain it.
He's clever, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, I think he's making fun of everything all at once. Mostly, he's kind of poking fun at the old Christians, but he's also making fun of the narrator and the more modern. They think they have it all figured out with these modern advantages. I think that he's kind of saying that neither of them have it figured
Right.
out.
You might say there is a certain amount, and certainly the narrator seems to be promoting a certain kind of poking fun at these pious Christian pilgrims who are kind of like country bumpkins. They don't know how to take care of all the modern conveniences, and why are they struggling with their things? We can have our really heavy luggage and have it taken, whisked away to the celestial city. Except that, you might say, there's the problem of the naming, right? To call somebody Mr. Smooth It Away is probably a reference to a transcendentalist thinker like Emerson, for example. Remember we said with Emerson, part of the problem with Emerson is that he might be insufficiently attuned to the problem of evil. We just smooth it away. So there's a sense in which the allegory, let's keep it away from the narrator as allegorist figure, the allegory certainly wants us to agree with that, right? I mean, we are smoothing it away. We most likely are hiding sin in our heart. And we really ought to be concerned with the fact that our train is being driven by a demon. Do we get where we want to go at the end of the celestial railroad? We most certainly do not. This is the last paragraph of the thing. And then did my excellent friend, Mr. Smooth It Away, laugh outright, in the midst of which cachinnation a smoke wreath issued from his mouth and nostrils, with a twinkle of lurid flame darted out of either eye, proving indubitably that his heart was all of a red blaze. The impudent fiend! To deny the existence of Tophet when he felt his fiery tortures raging within his breast. I rushed to the side of the boat, intending to fling myself on shore, but the wheels, as they began their revolutions, threw a dash of spray on me, so cold, so deathly cold, with that chill that will never leave those waters until death be drowned in his own river, that with a shiver and a heartquake, I awoke. Thank heaven it was a dream, right? It's a dream vision that turns out to be a nightmare. So one of the things I wanted to see is that Hawthorne is, in a very complicated way, manipulating the allegorical mode. I think you're absolutely right. As a story, it actually holds our interest in a way that Pilgrim's Progress doesn't. I mean, it's interested in details. It's referring back to Pilgrim's Progress, but it's representationally much more rich. It's almost like these people do have certain kinds of characterization. On the other hand, I would say it's a kind of manipulation of the allegorical mode that's still allegorical. The meaning is still, even though we might be tempted to make fun of people who are too pious, we ought to be very afraid of people who try to take shortcuts to moral behavior or to good behavior, or think that they can be saved by doing the equivalent of taking the railroad. Because the railroad may turn out to be, run by demons in the end. We might have sold our souls in trying to do it the easy way and taking these shortcuts. So you might say this is almost, the allegory is suggesting that we should be critical of thinkers like Emerson who don't sufficiently understand the pull of evil. And in that sense, we're meant to be there with the allegorist, the larger allegorist, the one who's written this whole thing. Not so much the narrative figure that has to wake up from the dream and maybe is enlightened. But the story itself wants us to see that there's a problem with 19th century notions of progress. We're going too quickly. We're disposing of original sin too quickly. And that would be a reason to remember back, Melville in Hawthorne and His Mosses, right? Melville has the same thing that he notices in Hawthorne. That Hawthorne is still worried by, and he dramatizes the pull of what we call, that Calvinist sense of depravity, right? Remember that from Hawthorne and His Mosses? That we need something somewhat like original sin. No thinking mind can do without that, to weigh the uneven balance, he says. We'll take a look at that again when we turn back to Moby Dick next week. But you can see that that's what's interesting about it. And I think that's illustrated by the story, as it were. Hawthorne has a certain kind of critique in mind for those who would quickly dispose of these kinds of the problem, you might say, of evil. Now that's relatively simple, I think, compared to what's going on in Young Goodman Brown, because Young Goodman Brown takes us at one further remove, right? Young Goodman Brown doesn't look exactly like this. Why would we think that Young Goodman Brown, you might say, why would we think that Young Goodman Brown has anything to do with allegory? Because there doesn't seem to be this kind of setup, right? This kind of setup that we have in Pilgrim's Progress, with a dreamer saying, I'm going to dream a dream, and that he uses here in the Celestial City. So what's allegorical about Young Goodman Brown? Yeah? Well, his wife's name is Faith. That's an allegorical element. Anything else? Yeah?
I think the fact that it is a dream vision, or potentially a dream, kind of sets up the allegorical situation, because a dream is kind of just like the realm of symbols, where things potentially have meanings that you map onto other things.
Okay. We want to think, I think, a little bit more about how that story makes use of dream, right? I mean, because in a dream vision, classical medieval dream vision, and then the way in which that's appropriated by Bunyan, it's basically a dream is something that's sent by God as a kind of teaching moment, right? We trust what's in dreams. The dreams reveal the progress of the Christian soul. The dream that Goodman Brown may or may not have is a little dodgier than that. Yeah.
I guess you could say it's kind of an allegory. Even though he doesn't use the names, some of the characters are representative of like bigger ideas. Like the mayor could be like government, and also Goody, I forget her name, could be like a bigger allegory for like pious people.
Okay, it's possible. I mean, certainly his name itself, right? It isn't Christian, but it's Goodman Brown. There's something generic about Brown and Goodman. He's about what happens to a good man. What I want to propose to you is this. I think it makes a difference the way the dreaming is treated. Not only because the dreaming is a little bit uncertain, whether it is a dream or whether it isn't a dream, but again, think of the standpoint of the dreamer. Who's doing the dreamer? Who's doing the dreaming in Bunyan and the Celestial Railroad? Who's doing the dreaming in Bunyan and the Celestial Railroad? The author, or the narrator figure. Who's doing the dreaming in Young Goodman Brown? It's Goodman Brown. So we are what? What's the triangulation? We have a narrator who is not the dreamer, but is watching a figure who is doing the dreaming. Maybe, if that's what he's doing. So where's the allegorist? In the allegories that we'll look briefly at, the dreamer is the allegorist. So where's the allegorist in Young Goodman Brown? It's Goodman Brown, right? Goodman Brown plays not necessarily the role of Christian, but he is someone we watch literally doing what allegorists do, possibly having this dream vision. We're not necessarily having the dream vision. Let's turn to it and take a look. One of the things I want to suggest to you is going on here is that this is a form of, if there's a way in which the Celestial Railroad is a kind of manipulation of the allegorical mode that nevertheless partakes in allegory, right? So it's a send-up of allegory, but it nevertheless is using allegorical techniques to make fun of something else other than allegory as well. In Young Goodman Brown, I'd suggest we really have a kind of anti-allegorical manipulation of the allegorical mode. Though the way to think about it is this: on page 1297, right, Goodman Brown meets this guy, and then he sees him again in the woods. He thinks he's there with his wife, Faith. Right, 1297. He's watching what he thinks of as this kind of meeting of the devil's disciples. They did so, and by the faith of the hell-kindled torches, the wretched man beheld his faith. And maybe that is allegorical, right? I mean, maybe it's not just his wife, but it's his faith. Nevertheless, the wife of her husband, trembling before that unhallowed altar. Lo, there ye stand, my children, said the figure, in a deep and solemn tone, almost sad with its despairing awfulness, as if his once angelic nature could yet mourn for our miserable race. Depending upon one another's hearts, ye had still hoped that virtue were not all a dream. Now are ye undeceived. Evil is the nature of mankind. Evil must be your only happiness. Welcome again, my children, to the communion of your race. Now, that's a statement. That's like a statement of the moral. That's the lesson. If it were Bunyan, that's what you would be supposed to believe, and you wouldn't have a doubt about it. Evil is the nature of mankind, Christians should go to the celestial city. Yes, we agree. Is that what the story Young Goodman Brown wants you to believe in the end? Does the story promote the view that evil is the nature of mankind? What do you think? Is that what you came away thinking? Evil is the nature of mankind? We saw the devil. Devil said evil is the nature of mankind. Everybody in the whole town was a devil worshiper. Pretty much looks like evil is the nature of mankind. Yeah?
Well, I feel like it can work both ways. On one hand, that's what you're supposed to take out, because he's never the same. If he kind of sees revelation proves to be true. There's the rest of his life in this kind of depressed throughout it. Then on one hand, maybe it's not true, because the next day maybe you can just blame it on a dream or a nightmare and just say that everyone else is fine except he. Let this get to him. I think you play both cards.
I think Hawthorne is always interested, again, I think that's right, in the both and in ambiguity, right? He's interested in probing at these in-between spaces. So he asks a question now. So we've said, okay, in allegory there's a dream. We're not even sure this is a dream. This is the bottom of 1297, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? Now, one of the things to say is that it's allegorical to the extent that what we are seeing is a kind of allegory of him losing his faith. So there's a literalized way in which what Goodman Brown sees is the literal loss of his faith because his wife is is named faith. So when he loses her to the devil, he's lost not only his wife, but his faith, with a capital F both ways, right? You understand? But what I want to suggest to you is that's still internal to Goodman Brown. We are not saying that we have lost faith as readers. We are watching someone losing faith. And what I suggest to you is that the story is dramatizing what it is like to think like an allegorist, and how easy it is if you think in this black and white way. Either everyone is evil or everyone is good, there's no in between, that you can lose your faith. Be it so if you will. Alas, it was a dream of evil omen for young Goodman Brown. A stern, a sad, a darkly meditative, a distrustful, if not a desperate man, did he become from the night of that fearful dream. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation were singing a holy psalm, he could not listen because an anthem of sin rushed loudly upon his ear and drowned all the blessed strain. When the minister spoke from the pulpit with power and fervid eloquence, and with his hand on the open Bible of the sacred truths of our religion and of saint-like lives and triumphant deaths and of future bliss or misery unutterable, then did Goodman Brown turn pale. Why? Because he's reading like an allegorist, right? They're saying one thing, but they mean another. They all look pious and good, but he is convinced that they're all evil. Only evil can he see around him. Then did Goodman Brown turn pale, dreading lest the roof should thunder down upon the grey blasphemer and his hearers. Often awaking suddenly at midnight, he shrank from the bosom of faith. And at morning or eventide, when the family knelt down at prayer, he scowled and muttered to himself and gazed sternly at his wife and turned away. And when he had lived long and was borne to his grave, a hoary corpse. And look at the guy. He's got a wonderful big family, followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession. Besides neighbors, not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. So think about it. We'll take this up again, but think about the way that has worked. What is the difference between that rendering of the way allegory works and the rendering we see either in Pilgrims Progress or Celestial Railroad? Again, I want to suggest to you that you might say that what this is dramatizing is the cultural problem of allegory. What happens to people, individuals, and what happens to a culture that thinks allegorically? And I'd suggest to you that that, in some sense, is one of the larger projects of that longer work that we'll look at called the Scarlet Letter. All right, that's it for now. Thanks.